that's really not. Sorry, y'all, we're just texting. Alright, I don't need to, Jesus Christ. Wow. God damn, there we go. Just. Alright, hey everybody, my name's Jamie, and I can't play guitar, and we haven't been amazing about regularly playing, but here we are today to hang out with y'all. We are doing our guitar practice, our daily 30 minutes of guitar practice, and we've missed a few days, so we're back to day 1 of our streak, but we'll get to 30, and you can join us today. First, we're going to tune up, and we're going to listen to Today Explained by Vox. The podcast is California is Becoming Uninsurable, and you can find that in the description or wherever you listen to podcasts. And then after that, it's about a 25-minute podcast. We're going to listen to the No Film School podcast, talking about how to switch roles within the film industry, and that is about an hour long. So if we can get through all of it, that'll be awesome. If not, we're going for at least 35 minutes of practice today. So thanks for hanging out. If you want to listen to these uninterrupted by me, you can always click the links and listen to them on your own time. If you have any questions, hit us up in the chat. We will be turning off our mic for most of the time, and only turning it back on to talk to y'all if we have some thoughts. But other than that, we'll just be listening to the podcast, and you can listen along with us. Have a great morning, and we're also going to work out of, like usual, the Hal Leonard Guitar Method Book 1. We're going to be on pages like 12 to 18 again today. Let's do it.
Not if you want to buy a house in California. State Farm and Allstate recently, to the shock of many, announced they won't insure new homes in the Golden State.
California homeowners didn't get much of a heads up, and so the announcement kind of freaked out a lot of people.
Insurance is a risk business, and climate change has made it too risky. The main culprit in California, wildfires, is not just a California problem. If you live in the Northeast United States, you've noticed a gray pall and the smell of smoke that's drifting down from fires in Canada. You can take comfort in the fact that you have homeowners insurance for now. Ahead on Today Explained, are insurance companies finally telling Americans what state and local governments refuse to? That some places in this country have become too risky to live in.
This episode is brought to you by Intuit. When did finances get so scary? Why do we avoid topics like taxes or debt? Well, it's time for that to change. With tools like TurboTax, Credit Karma, QuickBooks, and MailChimp, Intuit helps you build confidence in your finances, whether it's starting that business you've always wanted or planning that trip you never want to forget. Intuit has helped over 100 million people take control of their finances. Now it's your turn. Visit Intuit.com for more.
This episode is brought to you by Talkiatry. Say hello to Talkiatry. They offer virtual in-network psychiatry to treat the most common mental health conditions like depression, anxiety, OCD, and trauma. Within a week, Talkiatry will match you with a doctor who fits your needs and takes your insurance. If you're ready for more accessible, more human psychiatry, let's talk. Get started at talkiatry.com/start. That's talkiatry.com/start.
It's Today Explained. I'm Noelle King. Ben Christopher writes about California housing for the news site Cal Matters, and he tells us that State Farm made its announcement late last month on a Friday afternoon, which if you work in news, you know means it is news you would like to vanish from the radar quickly. I asked Ben what reason State Farm gave.
So State Farm laid out three main reasons it was not doing new business in the California home insurance market.
Number one, historic increases in construction costs outpacing inflation, rapidly growing catastrophe exposure, and a challenging reinsurance market. In other words, kind of a toxic combination of all factors.
All three of these things, they kind of boil down to the same underlying issue, which is wildfire risk.
Wildfire risk. Okay, explain construction costs outpacing inflation. Why do construction costs matter here?
Yeah, so the high cost of construction makes rebuilding really expensive in California. Rising construction costs are not specifically a California issue. We've heard a lot about inflation and supply chain bottlenecks. There was a run-up in the prices for lumber earlier during the pandemic, but the prices of other raw materials have gone up as well. And in California specifically, there is an overall shortage of workers in residential construction. That's one of the many reasons that building in California is so expensive. And so construction costs are high in California, but from an insurance company perspective, that's really only an issue if you need to rebuild a bunch of homes all at once, as you would after a big fire.
After fire, okay. Growing catastrophe exposure, the second one. You said it's basically wildfires. California does have other problems. Flooding has been an issue over the winter. We saw some of that. Would fires be the sole thing that they're pointing to?
Yeah, fire's the biggie. I mean, everyone knows California has earthquakes. We're the earthquake state.
Right.
But fire is the big one.
The threat of wildfires has grown every year, ripping through forests, scarring hillsides, destroying whole communities.
It's the one that's getting much more expensive, much worse. To put that in perspective, of the top 20 most destructive wildfires in California history in terms of the number of buildings destroyed, 13 of them have been since 2017.
And then these companies are also citing the reinsurance market, which means what exactly?
Yeah, so reinsurance is just insurance that insurance companies buy for themselves. Let's say an insurance company is doing business in rural California or in another kind of high-risk area like the Gulf Coast, and all of a sudden there's a big natural disaster and the company gets hit with tens of thousands of claims all at once. If they have reinsurance on those policies, that means they don't have to pay out the entire bill. They can pass along some of the cost to this other company, and depending on how big the natural disaster is, without reinsurance, that could throw the company into bankruptcy, so it's a protective measure. The problem is that the people who run reinsurance companies, they read the news too, and they know that California's wildfire problem is not going away anytime soon, and so the cost of reinsurance has gone up as well, making it much more costly, much more risky for insurance companies to sell insurance in California.
If I'm a homeowner in California, or I plan on moving to California and buying a house, what does this mean for me?
Well, so if you are a homeowner and you have a State Farm policy right now or an Allstate policy right now, you are good for now. So for now, this is a no new customer policy. Insurance companies do renew their policies every year. Whether this means that State Farm is going to get more picky about who it covers when it comes time to renew, we don't know yet. But for now, this is just for new customers.
State Farm and Allstate are both large companies, kind of household name companies. How big a deal is this for people in California? Do they have other choices?
They do, but State Farm is the biggie. They are the biggest player in the state's home insurance market. As of 2021, which is the last time this data was made public, they had about 20% of the home insurance market in California as market share. And that's in part why this was seen as such a big deal, even though they're hardly the first to rethink their exposure level in California. So you had AIG. They announced that they were getting out of the California home insurance market entirely last year. We mentioned Allstate. They made their announcement last year, although no one really noticed it at the time. And then really going back to 2017, you've had this more under-the-radar selective drawdown across California with insurance companies telling customers, particularly in fire-prone areas, that they wouldn't be renewing their policies. And that's left many parts of California, in particular rural California, as these kinds of insurance deserts where home insurance policies are just either astronomically expensive or not available at all.
Insurance companies are in business to make money, right? We can all acknowledge that.
I think that's true.
Why can't the insurance companies just do what companies normally do when a thing costs them more dearly and raise everybody's premiums?
Yeah, well, they would really like to do that. But California, like a lot of states, has a Department of Insurance that regulates many insurance markets and has to approve proposed rate increases. In California, like 10 other states, we elect our insurance commissioner, whose job it is to regulate most of the state's insurance markets and to approve any rate increases. So all insurance premium hikes in the home insurance market have to go through the state's Department of Insurance. And particularly as wildfire costs have increased, you've had insurance industry groups complaining that California's commissioner has not allowed them to charge the rates needed to make covering homeowners in California worth it. Incidentally, State Farm back in February requested an almost 30% rate hike that's still pending.
Consumer groups are saying that State Farm is basically trying to publicly pressure you into approving some of the rate hikes that they were proposing, right in the ballpark of about $700 million. Do you think they're trying to pressure you into approving those?
Absolutely not. Look, we have...
People didn't pay attention to that much at the time. Now people are realizing, oh, well, maybe that was an indication of where things were going. State Farm didn't mention rate hikes in its announcement when it said that they were pulling back a bit from the California market, but that's the other side of the equation. We were talking about the different rising costs, but their ability to pass those costs along to customers is pretty restricted.
Why would these companies put a stop to new insurance policies in the entire state and not just restrict it to the areas where wildfires have been a problem?
There are a couple of possible reasons. So one is we think of wildfire as this fundamentally rural problem. Increasingly, it's not, both because of development into these wildland areas where wildfires are a risk, and also just because wildfire, as a result of climate change and forest management, is becoming more of a suburban problem. So the San Francisco Bay Area suburbs, the hills above Oakland, suburban San Diego, the Inland Empire, which is the fastest growing part of the state, these are all places that have seen big destructive fires in recent history. The other issue is that since the 1960s, California has had a state-sponsored insurance company of last resort called the FAIR Plan. And the FAIR Plan offers really expensive and skimpy coverage, but if you're someone who cannot buy insurance from anywhere else in the state, you can always fall back on the FAIR Plan. And so now the FAIR Plan is saddled with a bunch of the riskiest home insurance policies in the state. And the question is, if there is a massive wildfire season and the FAIR Plan runs out of money, what happens? And legally, the answer is the FAIR Plan is funded by putting fees on private insurers that are doing business in California in proportion to their market share. So the bigger you are in California, the more you would have to pay to bail out the FAIR Plan. And if and when that needs to be bailed out, that could be really, really expensive. And so that might be another reason that the big players like State Farm would want to pare back its overall exposure in California, not just in the high-risk areas.
California already has a terrible housing shortage, by a lot of measures the worst in the country. And I wonder whether the knock-on effect of this over time is that fewer homes get built in California.
Yeah, this doesn't help. Most people need a mortgage to buy a house. Lenders generally don't offer home loans without insurance. California actually experienced something like the worst case scenario version of this back in the mid-90s. We had a big earthquake in Southern California.
It struck without any warning.
Evacuate the area.
The deadly Northridge earthquake rips through the Southland while most people were asleep, flattening freeways, bursting gas lines, and squashing buildings.
Insurance companies decided to stop doing business in California basically all at once, and the entire real estate market just kind of ground to a halt across the state because no one could buy a home, because there wasn't insurance available. We're not there yet, but we have been seeing this kind of slow motion version. Unfortunately, the solution to this current problem, proposed both by insurance companies but also a lot of independent policy experts, is that insurance companies need to be allowed to charge more, commensurate with the increasing risk in California. But that's not a super appealing option either. As you mentioned, California, it's a really expensive place to buy a home. It's already prohibitively expensive for most people. So layering on this new higher cost on top of that is not great for would-be homeowners. And for an elected insurance commissioner in California, it's really bad politics too.
There are some challenges, but we're working on them. And I'm very confident we're going to bring these companies back.
One of the really interesting things here is that the market has now started to move on climate change. We will no longer insure homes in the state in a way that the state itself is not doing, right? California isn't saying, well, you can't build a home in this wildfire zone. You've just got to find your own insurance. In America, we do often defer to markets, and I wonder, do you think that this could change or move the needle in a way on how California starts to think about climate change and about what's necessary? Does the market lead the state in this case?
Yeah, to a certain extent, that is a possibility here, where rather than having a sort of top-down, perhaps more thoughtful, policy-led reconsideration of where development happens in California, it is being led simply by the increasing cost of insurance. That's probably not the most desirable or least costly way to manage this change that might be foisted upon the state, but at the moment they do seem to be leading this reconsideration of where homes get built.
You are our man in California for the purposes of this episode, so let me ask you, can you imagine the state of California at some point saying there will be places in this state where people simply cannot have houses?
There was actually a legislative proposal just this year to put new restrictions on where you could develop in what's called the wildland-urban interface, which is basically just rural areas that are at most risk of wildfire while prioritizing development in urban areas. The bill died, and so at least for now, it's not a politically feasible proposal to make. But as wildfires continue to get worse and as insurance costs continue to increase, perhaps that political calculation will change.
That was Ben Christopher of Cal Matters. This is not just happening in California, because climate change is not just happening in California. Coming up, what managed retreat looks like.
At KeyBank, we know a small moment like, ooh,
All right, I gotta take a quick refreshment break. Be back in 5 minutes or less. We'll see you then.
sandals would go really well with a beach.
Can lead to an even bigger question like,
should I splurge on a trip this year?
And that's the type of moment where we'll meet you with financial advice on everything from budgeting for travel to building savings. So maybe that destination isn't too far off. What do you think, Cindy?
I think these sunglasses would go well with a tiny umbrella drink.
For every financial need, we'll meet you in the moment. KeyBank opens doors. KeyBank member FDIC.
So, what are you thinking for lunch?
I can't. I'm getting new window treatments.
Why don't you just go to Blinds.com?
Because I need custom products.
Blinds.com products are made to order, and they ship samples to you fast and free.
Wow, how convenient. Tell me more.
They can even verify your measurements and handle the installation. Plus, their 100% satisfaction guarantee.
Well, you've convinced me. Let's go eat. I've got time now.
Shop Blinds.com and save 40% on selected products. Rules and restrictions may apply.
It's Today Explained. I'm Noelle King. Umair, go ahead and give me your full name and tell me what you do.
My name is Umair Irfan, and I'm a science reporter at Vox.
Okay, so we've just spent a couple minutes talking about California and insurers there, large insurers there, saying we simply won't insure new homes. Are there other parts of this country where insurers have said, nah, not worth it?
Oh, absolutely. And this has been a trend that's been going on for a few years, particularly in coastal states around the Gulf Coast, namely Florida and Louisiana. They've seen some of the biggest declines in insurance coverage in recent years. Insurance is regulated at the state level, and regulators have to balance basically the business case for insurance, how much they pay out versus how much they take in, as well as the policy case, basically how much people can actually afford to pay. And in a lot of cases, the insurers are telling the state regulators that they can't balance their books based on the amount of risk that they're facing. In coastal areas, that makes a lot of sense that, hurricanes, particularly in areas like the Gulf Coast, are causing a lot more damage. And that's because populations are growing in those vulnerable areas. About 40% of the U.S. population lives in a coastal county. About 80% of the U.S. population lives within 100 miles of a border area. So not just direct damage, but indirect costs from lost business and revenue. Those are big things that are really, vulnerable to a lot of climate and disaster-linked events. And so these insurance companies are just saying that the business landscape is just impossible for them to operate in with the constraints that they're facing.
In the first half of the show, we were talking to Ben Christopher about California's FAIR Plan. If you can't get insurance through anyone else, the FAIR Plan will insure you. Do other states have things like that, or is it just California?
Several states have developed a system where they have an insurer of last resort, and that's basically what it sounds like. If nobody else will provide you a policy, the state will. The trade-off, though, is that these are very expensive policies, that they're usually something that a lot of people can't easily afford, and they're meant to also serve as a signal that, you're going to have to pay for it because you're facing a higher risk, and maybe buying insurance may not be the best way forward, that you should think about relocating or potentially investing in hardening your infrastructure against things like sea level rise or building a larger defensible perimeter against wildfire. But in most states that do have an insurer of last resort, they only insure a tiny fraction of properties. So it's mostly the people who are most desperate or the people who have the most money who can actually avail themselves of this service.
It is the nudge thing that's so fascinating to me. It's the state saying, listen, if you can't find another insurer and we're going to charge you up the wazoo, maybe you shouldn't be buying that home. Maybe you shouldn't be building in that area, as opposed to the state simply saying, no, the insurance company says that place is too risky for you to build your retirement home. Companies won't insure you. We're not going to insure you either. You cannot buy there. Has the state ever just said we're shutting it down?
I mean, states have tried, but property developers are a powerful political constituency in most states. Several years ago in North Carolina, for instance, they started trying to factor sea level rise into their forecast for coastal damages. And when they started doing that, the insurance rates for coastal properties went up.
In 2012, North Carolina passed a law banning the state from making policy based on predictions of rising ocean levels.
And so that raised a lot of, consternation and mockery at the time.
I think this is a brilliant solution. If your science gives you a result that you don't like, pass a law saying that the result is illegal. Problem solved.
But it shows some of the tensions that these regulators and state officials and property developers are all facing right now. And similarly for individual homeowners, we try to send a signal, but it's not really easy to pick up stakes and move. If your insurance rate goes up, we've seen more often than not, people just let their insurance coverage lapse. We saw that happen last year when the federal National Flood Insurance Program actually started to raise their premiums.
The majority of Florida homeowners who may start seeing huge spikes in their flood insurance rate, 1.7 million Floridians have bought policies through FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program.
And it's not just impacting waterfront mansions.
The number of homeowners basically who said that they couldn't afford the new premiums, they didn't move, they just stopped paying for insurance. And now if there is a flood, knowing that there's a higher risk of flooding, they're just going to be out of luck if that happens.
For a time now, it has seemed like the government has ignored the market and said, okay, as in the case with wildfires or floods in some part of the country, we will help. What do you think this is telling us, that the government is willing to step in where companies won't?
It shows that, there is, again, a tension between the business model and the public interest here. The National Flood Insurance Program is a federal program, and that was created because very few private insurers would offer flood insurance at all. Now, the problem with the federal, flood insurance program is that they try to subsidize the rates, but it's not enough to cover their books. The flood insurance program has been in debt for a very long time. Congress wrote down about $16 billion of flood insurance debt in 2017. The program...
Apologies, because we know to y'all this conversation they're having is riveting, but we were listening to the Vox Today Explained podcast. We're going to go quickly soon to the... what the hell is making? Okay, anyway. That noise is fucking horrendous. I don't know if y'all can hear it. Anyway, we're on... our book on page 16, Word Man Blues, and then we're going to go through to about page 20. That's it. And we'll switch over to the podcast. Thanks for watching.
still has about $20 billion in debt right now, and they even raised their rates last year, and it's still not enough to cover their books. Now, the federal government basically has a blank check to continue doing these kinds of things, but again, if you're a private insurer and you're looking at billions of dollars in debt, that's not something that you can sustain. And so obviously, there's something of a public interest and private business mismatch here, and it's likely that something has to give.
A couple years ago, you wrote a piece for Vox about something called managed retreat. Can you explain what managed retreat is and how it might fit in here?
Well, managed retreat is this idea that we start pulling back from vulnerable areas that are extremely prone to wildfires, areas that are likely to see a lot of flooding, not just in coastal areas, but maybe along riverbanks, for instance. And essentially, we try to encourage homeowners to move. We buy out their properties, compensate them, and try to relocate them to areas that are safer. Or for the people that don't move, we help subsidize investments to make them more resilient to things like wildfires and flooding. The problem is, of course, that it's expensive to do this, and also people don't want to move. They move to these regions to begin with for a reason, that these are the places where they can afford, or, they value the waterfront property, or they enjoy being close to the wilderness areas. That's sort of the exact selling points that brought them to that area in the first place. And it's been a little bit more difficult to do that. And so they try to use these nudges, but those nudges can only go so far given the powerful economic forces that force people to stay. And so the question then is just like, how do you do this? I think there's also the equity question that, people who can afford to buy homes, especially in these expensive areas, maybe they should be paying for their own resilience. They should be paying for their own retreat rather than the taxpayer helping them out here. But at the same time, people have to live somewhere, and it's really hard to find a place that isn't going to be vulnerable to some kind of risk at some point in the future. We've seen, wildfires in the Midwest this year. We've seen epic dust storms, drought. Arizona recently in Phoenix, they said that they're going to stop development in that area because they're worried about running out of groundwater. So there are some kinds of backstops. There are some limits to what we can do, but the question is, what do you do with the existing property? What do you do with the people who are already living there? And that is really a big conflict that's brewing. It's already starting to happen. I mean, in the United States, we do have climate refugees effectively. In some of the barrier islands around Louisiana and the Gulf Coast, Ile de Jean-Charles, there's already an indigenous native community that's being federally relocated.
It is the first federally funded community relocation in the country, brought on by sinking grounds and rising sea levels along Louisiana's disappearing coast in crisis.
They're having some of their property bought up, and they're being moved towards areas further inland into other areas. We're seeing some of this happening with indigenous communities in the Alaskan barrier islands, but these are, very small piecemeal projects, and they're happening to, scattered communities. We're not seeing the sort of wholesale relocation you would need for protecting a city like Miami, for instance, that's right there on the waterfront. But we do have some of this processes already underway. And obviously, there's a lot of tension there as well. I mean, people have a very strong sense of place that, you lose that when you're forced to relocate, when your home is being swallowed up by water or destroyed in a disaster. And so there's also this sort of mental health problem here that we also have to deal with, this sort of social dislocation that we're also starting to see as well. And we're just beginning to grapple with that.
That was Vox's Umair Irfan. Today's show was produced by Avishai Artsy and edited by Matthew Collette. It was fact-checked by Laura Bullard and engineered by Michael Raphael. I'm Noelle King. It's Today Explained.
Next up, how to transition within roles in the film industry. Thanks for watching. I am Jamie. I can't play guitar. If you all have joined me, today is try number 50 million at playing guitar.
A pair of Ray-Ban sunglasses. And when they look like a pair...
Whatever you're saying.
Ripper. It's him. I know my killers.
No. Yes. This is one of my favorite podcasts, the No Film School podcast. It is a filmmaking, content creation, whatever the fuck you want to call it, podcast. I love it. The hosts are great. They are all extremely talented and just interesting people. So let's get it going. Flamin' Hot director Eva Longoria. Really? Like that? Like the A-list celebrity? Let's check it out.
Variety listed among the most anticipated shows of the summer.
What if we make a podcast about this? We could bring him in on it.
Bring the killer in on what?
The podcast.
From the Emmy Award-nominated producer of The Boys and the Emmy Award-nominated executive producer of Ozark.
Are you in danger?
No, I'm hiding something.
We are in too deep.
Starring Kaylee Cuoco and Chris Messina. A new original series called Based on a True Story. Only on Peacock.
Sergeant and Mr. Smith, you're gonna love this house.
Bunk beds in a closet?
There's no field manual for finding the right home. But when you do, USAA Homeowners Insurance can help protect it the right way. Restrictions apply.
This episode is brought to you by Intuit. When did finances get so scary? Why do we avoid topics like taxes or debt? Well, it's time for that to change. With tools like TurboTax, Credit Karma, QuickBooks, and MailChimp, Intuit helps you build confidence in your finances, whether it's starting that business you've always wanted or planning that trip you never want to forget. Intuit has helped over 100 million people take control of their finances. Now it's your turn. Visit Intuit.com for more.
Hey everybody, welcome to the No Film School podcast for the week of June 8th, 2023. Our subject, first off, I'm Charles Hain. I'm here with Jason Hellerman.
Hey.
And Gigi Hawkins.
Hello.
Our subject this week is transitioning roles within the film industry. It is a thing that people do and want to do. And how do you do it? And what are the costs and benefits of doing it? So the first thing, if you're not already in the industry, don't climb a ladder you don't want to get to the top of. That classic advice from the English office, right? Like, you want to get on the ladder that you want to climb, and getting on the wrong ladder and then being like, oh, and I'll be able to switch later is very tricky. However, many people get on a ladder, climb it for a while, and decide they want to move to a different ladder. And it's fine. Try and avoid it if you can, but if you got to do it, it happens. I was recently reading a book on business accounting, and I learned that the very term multi-hyphenate, which is like a very common term now for like many people have many things, came from the film industry in the 70s. Like it started as a film industry term and then it sort of spread out to the rest of the world, which I had no idea, because people in the film industry would like start as writers and then they'd add directing, or they'd start as an actor and then they'd add producing or whatever. And it is a thing where as you go along, I know a lot of people who were DPs, then directors, then became showrunners. I know people who like started in Steadicam and pivoted over. And the reason why is when you reach a certain level, it is a relationship-based industry, and the people you're building relationships with as a high-end Steadicam op, as a high-end DP, are often the same people who are doing hiring or collaborating with directors and producers. So it makes sense. The first thing I'd kick off with, and then I'll open it up to Jason and Gigi, is the higher you climb, the easier it is to hop to other verticals. It is very hard. If you're mid-level up the art department ladder and you try and jump to another ladder, you're probably going to be starting back at the bottom. If you've made it to the top of a ladder, it is easier to move to the other ladders. It's still difficult, but it's easier. And that can be tricky. Once if you're halfway up a ladder and you're like, oh man, I actually don't want to be a production designer. That actually doesn't sound fun to me anymore. I wish I had climbed writing instead. If you haven't achieved, if you're not swimming in the circles where you're meeting those higher end producers, your 10 years in art department doesn't actually help you that much, which is a bummer, I have to say. But yeah, Jason, Gigi, you guys have some other experiences with this.
Yeah, when starting out as, indie scrappy director, writer, I was so wary of wearing the producer hat or even calling myself a producer, because I had come from this career where I was on the business side of the creative and I had been put into that box. So I was terrified that if I even said that I was producing something, that I would get put into that box again and have the creative taken away from me. I eventually watched the Beatles documentary and saw how Paul keeps everyone together and is like, come on guys, we have to do this. And I was like, oh, maybe I'm a Paul and I can just sort of like accept that you have to be a producer, and especially while you're directing and coming up this way. But I did take a job as an assistant to a producer and spent 5 months learning so much about the industry, and that was invaluable. But I think there came a time where somebody was like, wait, what? You don't want to produce? And I was like, no, I want to write and direct. I thought I said that. And, oh, you've seen me as a producer this whole time. So I was kind of putting myself in this box. And the crazy, but I think smart thing that I did was when an opportunity arose for me to pursue my career as a writer, getting into a lab, I actually left that job because I saw I kept my eye on the prize, and I, to Charles's point, was able to identify what the ladder was. So I think I was at that early stage and was able to make that leap. And unfortunately, I wasn't high enough on the ladder to make that career transition, which is one of the reasons that I'm particularly interested in this. But I have to say, I haven't seen people at that mid-tier make the leap. It's only when they're like very high up in the department and then they go and make something separately and prove that they can do it. There is a superpower, though, that you have if you know everything about, say, props, or everything about, say, editing. Our interview with Kabir, the TV director who has directed over 46 episodes of TV, he started as an editor. And I think that, if you ascend to the top and then start to make it known that you want to be doing something else, you can leverage your superpower from that initial ladder climb.
I feel like I've probably talked about my origin enough on the website, but I don't know if I've talked about it on the podcast. And Gigi and I just had dinner a couple weeks ago and talked about this, but I started as an assistant, worked my way up from a runner. It's scot-free, so just driving around town to then becoming an assistant to a producer there. And then he went off and opened his own wing at Sony, and I went with him and was his assistant for a while. Then I became story editor, which is just like all the scripts would be sent to me. I'd organize them in files. I was in charge of all the coverage that was on them. And then eventually became a creative executive. So like you're starting to take meetings with, writers and directors, just sort of the lowest level executive possible. And then in the middle of all that, had sold the screenplay and then just decided to step away from that life and pursue writing. And I think a lot of like the ability to pursue writing post selling something obviously is much easier, but also like I knew agents around town. I knew, like who called in and who I thought was good on the phone, or like who I thought pitched their clients well. So when I was picking agents and managers, I was like, oh, I like these people because I've heard them go to bat for other people. I also was able to talk to peers in that situation and be like, hey, do you also like these people? Is this just a performance they put on the phone for my boss who's very powerful, but maybe your boss is less so, and like what's your feeling there? One thing I've never talked about is that after Show Buddies and I'm off making movies and we have a couple dry years where a bunch of stuff falls apart, and I had a huge movie that fell apart twice, heartbreaking. I did creep my way back to possibly becoming an executive again. Went in an interview, got hired as an executive at a different company, and then the next day found out no film school was going to pay me to write articles. And I was like, you know what, maybe I don't want to give up the dream yet. Wound up backing out of that position. So like, I think one thing, you can do is you could always go back, right? As long as you have the experience, you have a track record. That was only maybe like 2 years or 3 years removed from my first executive job where I could be like, oh, I went out and not only did I make my own movie, but I was a producer on it. And I had, at least like a marketable experience that I think like looked good to the people who were hiring me. And also like I knew the people I was interviewing for. Okay,
specifically about that time where you were maybe about to go back. How did you feel in that moment? Did you feel like this was a step back or a pause or I can still learn in this role? Like, what was your mindset?
Yeah, I think, look, you're immediately going to feel like a failure, right? Because like I left to be a writer because I wanted to be a writer. That's all I wanted to do. That's why I moved out to Hollywood. I was good at, I think, the producing creative executive point because I liked working with writers and directors. I loved having them come in and brainstorm ideas. So it was tough then to maybe like swallow your pride and be like, maybe I need to go back to that. And in my mind, I thought of it as a pause, but also had the fear of knowing that like being an executive at a company that wanted to make things, and the place that hired me was for an Academy Award nominated actor, and like it's gonna be probably like a 70-hour-a-week job, and that's being generous with giving myself a weekend. I knew that like the pause would be just hopefully to make more connections, but also like that I wouldn't probably be doing any work for the next couple years. So the terror and the rest of it, but it's also like in Hollywood, the one thing you need is a job, right? You have to pay your rent, you have to do whatever. And when writing sort of dried up and I was doing commercials at the time, there weren't that many. I was like, I need to find a way to have an income. Otherwise, like I'm gonna run out of money in a couple months. And that was like, for those, many people know you can't just go apply for writing jobs. Even if you get them, it might take 6 or 7 months to get paid. I was unsure, and then wound up perchance meeting Ryan Kuhn, starting to write blogs for No Film School, and was able to bridge the gap. And then I think maybe 2 weeks after turning that job down, I wound up getting a huge assignment and then getting paid and being able to balance it. But it is that sort of thing where you're kind of going back and forth and unsure what to do. But also like you're developing a network in each specificity, right? So Charles, yeah.
Well, one of the beauties of film is that you talked about the gap in your resume. I didn't really appreciate, my wife is a normal human who doesn't work in film, and like she's concerned about things like gaps in her resume. But like in film, no one gives a shit. Like, oh,
okay, sorry, we're gonna cut Charles Haynes off there. Charles Haynes, sorry, Charles, you're like always giving out the best advice, making me feel better, making me not just like feel better, but like. Charles is very good at allowing space for differences, but he gives honest opinions as well, typically without being condescending. And it's a skill I feel like he may know he possesses. Anyway, we had a good session. We're going to cut that short, but you can find the No Film School podcast anywhere you watch podcasts. That was the one talking about switching roles in the film industry as of as of June 2023, June 8th, 2023, which is today. If you're watching this live, and not today if you're not watching this on June 8th, 2023. But that's when, around the time the podcast came out, I think it might have come out on the 7th or the 6th, which would be good stuff. Who cares? Go find No Film School podcast and Vox Today Explained if you want to be informed and listen to the podcast we just were, and follow our channel by subscribing and hitting the bell notification so you can be notified when we go live every day between what now looks like 4 a.m. and 5:30 a.m. Most days. So we'll see you back tomorrow. We love you. Have a great day.